You think you know Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the woman who ruled without a man, who crushed the Spanish Armada and stared down popes, princes, and every nobleman who thought they could tame her. But the story doesn't begin with crowns or battles or golden ages. It starts in a cold bedroom, before dawn, in the winter of the year 1547, where a 13-year-old girl wakes up every morning terrified because she knows he's coming. She doesn't know exactly when, but the footsteps are always soft, always barefoot, always his. Thomas Seymour, her stepfather, her abuser. He walks in without shame, half-dressed, grinning, calling it a joke, calling it love. But Elizabeth knows what it is. She's a princess. She's also completely alone. And he knows that. She had just buried her father, Henry VIII, the man who beheaded her mother and still called himself her protector. She had no brothers to trust, no court to shelter her, and no mother to pull her into safety. The world saw her as a future queen. Thomas Seymour saw her as an opportunity. And Catherine Parr, the stepmother she adored, saw nothing, or pretended not to. That's the horror of this story. Every adult around her either joined in, looked away, or moved on. History tried to erase it. Tudor apologists called it flirtation, affection, politics. But behind all those words was a child who wrote, in trembling Latin, 3 words on the edge of a letter: "Let him not touch me." And when he did it anyway, she crossed them out and tried again. Because no one listened. They say Thomas Seymour was handsome, powerful, the brother of the Lord Protector, uncle to the boy king, a war hero. But he was also a predator, one who groomed his stepdaughter, whispered poison into her ear, and walked into her room every morning like he owned her. He told jokes, pulled back her blankets, slapped her playfully, and then crawled into bed with her. That's not affection. That's not courtship. That's grooming. That's abuse. And when Catherine Parr joined him one morning, yes, joined him, and laughed as he and she tickled Elizabeth under her morning gown, something broke inside that girl. Something final. Because even the woman she loved most, the one she called mother, was now holding her down with a smile. People still argue about what happened. They say, we don't know if it went too far. As if crawling into a child's bed half naked isn't already too far. As if the way she flinched, how she got up earlier each day to dress before he arrived, how she grew pale and sick and silent, how she wrote desperate messages in Latin on envelopes, as if all that wasn't enough, as if we need proof beyond the shaking of a 13-year-old's hands. What we do know is that by the time she was 15, she had learned to survive. She had learned to outmaneuver men who wanted her crown and her body, and she had learned, most of all, to keep her heart locked behind a wall. No one would ever climb again. Thomas Seymour thought he was clever. He thought he could use Elizabeth to climb higher. When his wife Catherine died, just a week after childbirth, he didn't mourn. He looked back toward the girl. He sent messages to her through servants, asking about her body, her great buttocks, as if she was a thing to be monitored, not a person who had barely escaped him. He planned to marry her. He plotted to kidnap the king. He thought his charm could shield him from the axe. But when he was finally arrested, charged with treason, and taken to Tower Hill, even then, he smiled. Even then, he believed he'd walk free. He didn't. The blade came down. And Elizabeth didn't weep. She said just one thing. This day died a man with much wit and very little judgment. No tears. No rage. No relief. Just precision. Cold. Calculated. She wasn't the girl in the bed anymore. She was already becoming the queen. And from that day on, she never allowed another man to touch her. Not one. Ambassadors came. Princes courted. Proposals poured in from every corner of Europe. She flirted. She smiled. She danced the dance. But she never said yes, because Thomas Seymour had taught her what desire looks like when it's dipped in power and cruelty. She had learned that to let a man close was to risk everything: her body, her throne, her safety, her soul. So when people ask why she never married, why she never let herself be ruled by a husband, you tell them this: it wasn't pride. It wasn't vanity. It wasn't politics. It was survival. Because long before Elizabeth ruled an empire, she ruled her own body. And after everything that was stolen from her at 13, she swore, "No man will own me again." That's where this story begins. Not with a crown, not with a sword, but with a child, in the dark, whispering to herself, "Let him not touch me." And when no one listened, she whispered again, and again, until finally, the whisper turned into a rain no man could touch. The palace at Enfield was wrapped in ice that winter, the kind of cold that seemed to hum through the stone itself, that seeped under doors and into the marrow of anyone still breathing inside. The child who would one day be queen stood by the window each morning, watching her own breath cloud the glass, tracing shapes in the frost before they melted under her fingers. She was 13, and the silence of the corridors had changed. Once, those halls had echoed with her father's boots, the clatter of servants, the weight of a king's laughter that filled rooms, whether it was joyful or cruel. Now there was only the echo of absence. Henry, the eighth of that name, the man who split Christendom and shattered his own heart 6 times over, was dead, and the kingdom had entered mourning black cloth on banners, ashes in the air, and a girl left behind who understood that grief in palaces is not gentle. It is political. Elizabeth Tudor was an orphan, but she was more than that. She was a symbol carved from contradiction. Her mother had been executed as a traitor. Her half-sister Mary prayed in Latin and hated her. Her little brother Edward had become king at 9. But a boy king is a puppet, and men with sharper minds and hungrier hearts were already pulling his strings. Elizabeth had learned early that in this world, the only safe weapon was intellect, so she studied until her eyes burned Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, not because she wanted to be learned, but because knowledge was armor. Every word she memorized was a shield against disappearance. Herr Governess, Cat Ashley, fussed over her like a mother hen, with a cracked heart. Cat brushed Elizabeth's red hair each night and whispered prayers over her. The sort of quiet invocations meant to keep monsters away. She did not know that the monster was already in the house, charming everyone, laughing easily, a handsome, in a way that made people forgive him before he even sinned. His name was Thomas Seymour, and he had entered their lives like a warm fire in winter, until one looked too close and realized the flames were not for comfort, but for consuming. He was 38, tall, dressed like a peacock, speaking with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him its daughters, brother to the new Lord Protector, uncle to the boy king, and newly married to the widowed Queen Dowager Catherine Parr. He had everything a man could desire except patience. And he wanted Elizabeth because she was young, royal, and unclaimed. When he smiled, The room softened. When he looked at you, it felt like sunlight. But Elizabeth, for all her youth, sensed something colder behind that brightness, a shadow that followed his charm. At first he sent her letters elegant, flattering, couched in the language of mentorship and affection. He spoke of her father, of duty, of learning, as though he were guiding her. Elizabeth replied with polite grace. Every sentence, a small wall between herself and him. Yet soon after, he married Catherine Parr, the woman Elizabeth loved like a mother. And that marriage should have meant safety. Catherine had once been the king's last wife, the calm in Henry's final storms, the woman who survived him. To live with her again felt like refuge. Elizabeth moved into their home, carrying her books and her dignity and perhaps a small, naive hope that grief could turn into peace. But peace is fragile when desire is hungry. The first morning she heard the footsteps. She thought she was dreaming, bare feet on the stones, the door opening without a knock. And there he was, the Queen's husband, smiling as though nothing were wrong, as though his presence in her chamber was an act of kindness. He wore a short nightgown, his hair uncombed, his hands resting on his hips as if surveying property. He said good morning, his voice lazy with amusement. She answered with silence, her body frozen, her breath locked. Then he touched her, not with affection, not with violence either, but with the casual confidence of a man who knew he could beg. A slap on her back, the brush of a hand too low. And then he laughed. I wished her well, and left. The next morning he came again. Elizabeth woke earlier, tried to be dressed before he arrived, her heart pounding with the rhythm of dread. But he always found her, and always smiled, that same disarming smile. When Cat Ashley began to notice, she started rising before dawn too, sitting quietly in the room like a guardian. Thomas did not care. He joked, teased, said he meant no evil, called it play, called it fatherly affection. He twisted the language of care into a mask for cruelty. Sometimes, Catherine joined him. That truth has puzzled historians for centuries. But the records whisper that twice, the Queen Dowager walked into that same room with her husband and laughed as he tickled Elizabeth in bed. Perhaps she thought it harmless. Perhaps she thought controlling the danger would neutralize it. But for the girl under the covers, there was no control, only betrayal. To have the woman she trusted most stand beside her tormentor turned the world inside out. Afterward, Catherine grew colder, jealousy replacing affection. She ordered Cat Ashley to watch Elizabeth's every move, accusing her of flirtation, of temptation, of being the one to invite sin. The victim became the suspect. As it so often happens when the powerful are confronted with their own guilt, the season turned. In the gardens of Hanworth, the sun finally thawed the frost, but not the silence. Thomas came upon Elizabeth while she was walking among the roses, and Catherine was near enough to see. He wrestled with the girl, laughing, pretending to be playful. And then, he pulled out a pair of scissors and cut her black morning gown to pieces while Catherine held her. Did the Queen grip her arms? Did she smile to hide her anger? No one recorded the expression on Elizabeth's face. But every account agrees that after that day, the warmth between them vanished. When the couple decided to move to London, Elizabeth was left behind at Hatfield House. For the first time in many months, she could breathe. No more footsteps. No more laughter outside her door. The nights became her own again. And yet, the peace felt fragile, like a bubble that could break if she exhaled too sharply. She spent her hours reading, writing letters, praying. She spoke little of what had happened. But Cat Ashley noticed how often she shivered at small sounds, how she avoided mirrors, how she slept with a candle burning near her bed. Trauma had no name in that century, only symptoms, and Elizabeth bore them all. The months passed, and Catherine, perhaps missing her stepdaughter or seeking to make amends, invited her again. Elizabeth hesitated. To refuse would be suspicious. To accept felt dangerous. She went. Because in Tudor England, a girl did not have the right to say no. At Chelsea Manor, the same pattern resumed the footsteps. The visits. The jokes that made her skin crawl. Cat confronted him again, warning him away, calling him shameless. He laughed. Power makes men deaf. One night, as Elizabeth prepared a letter for Catherine to send, she paused. The parchment was blank except for the address. Her keel trembled. She wrote in Latin, "Thou touch me not." Then, after a long breath, she crossed the words out and replaced them. "Let him not touch me." A secret plea, written in the language of scholars, so that only those educated enough might understand. Hidden in plain sight, like a prayer disguised as obedience. Those 5 words were all she could say, because any louder cry might have meant her death. That is how survival looked for a Tudor princess, not in running away or fighting back, but in learning to write her own boundaries, even if no one read them. That is how the legend of the Virgin Queen truly began. Not with coronations or victory speeches, but with a trembling hand and a scratched-out line on a piece of paper. Outside, the Thames rolled dark and indifferent under the winter sky. Inside the manor, the Queen Dowager's household moved through its routines, unaware that history was being reshaped in the silence of one child's suffering. Elizabeth lay awake each night, listening to the river, wondering if the sound of water could wash memories away. But memories cling like frost. You can scrape them from the glass, but they return with the next cold. And still she learned. Every dawn that came without footsteps was a small victory. Every evening without laughter, at her expense, was a reprieve. She was learning to observe, to measure words before speaking them, to smile without revealing her thoughts. The skills that would one day make her the most cunning monarch in Europe were born not in classrooms or councils but in those mornings of fear. When she finally became queen, she would speak with calm precision, wield charm like a blade, and trust no man completely. But for now she was still that girl in the frozen palace, standing at her window, breathing on the glass, watching her reflection fade into the fog, whispering the only truth that mattered. Let him not touch me. The snow had not yet melted from the courtyards of Enfield when the first letter arrived. It was February of the year 1547, and Elizabeth had only just begun to breathe again after her father's death. The palace was still draped in mourning, and the air inside her chambers tasted of dust and ash and pressed linen. Somewhere deep inside her, and grief was folding itself into quiet shapes. The kind that did not scream or sob but simply settled into the joints. Waiting, her half-brother Edward, only 9 years old, had taken the throne, and with that shift of power came new whispers, new eyes, new dangers. Elizabeth was a Tudor. Yes, but she was not safe. Her mother had been executed. Her birth had been declared illegitimate. Her very existence was a complication. So when the letter came, its edges clean, its seal crisp with wax, she felt the threat before she even broke it open. The handwriting was practiced, fluid, just courtly enough to feign respect. It was from Thomas Seymour. He did not call her child. He did not use the tender, distant language of guardianship. Instead, he wrote to her as though she were a woman, a bride, a partner in something grand. He proposed marriage. She read it twice before speaking. 13 years old. And already she knew how to read beyond words. How to see what lived between the lines. She had been raised to decipher diplomacy, to translate pleasantries into their sharper truths. This letter was not affection. It was ambition. Thomas Seymour, a man 25 years older than she was, a man who had married her stepmother not 3 weeks after the king's death, was reaching out with his eyes on the throne, not on her heart. He was charming. That was the trouble. People spoke of him as though his smile erased sins, as though being handsome was the same as being good. Elizabeth did not trust charm. Not even then. Especially not then. She had seen what it could become. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had once dazzled an entire court, had made a king into a church, and it had ended with blood on the scaffold and a daughter labeled a bastard. Charm had cost her everything. Elizabeth sat with the letter for an hour before answering it. She did not cry. She did not ask Cat Ashley for guidance. She merely picked up her quill and began to write. Her reply was, everything. His was not. Graceful. Formal. Precise. There was no anger in it. No scandal. No accusation. She wrote as a princess ought to write, with dignity that could not be dismantled. She thanked him for his offer. She expressed sorrow that her mourning would last 2 years. As custom demanded, she reminded him gently of her youth. She did not say the word no, but her letter was a wall built from soft stones. She sent it with her own seal. She did not ask Cat to proof it. She did not need help. That was the lesson she had already begun to learn. When the men in power want something from you, your best weapon is your voice, calm, cold, and carved in ink. Thomas Seymour received the letter. What he felt upon reading it, no one knows. But what he did next was clear. He turned from Elizabeth and married Catherine Parr. Quickly, quietly. Perhaps he had loved Catherine once. Perhaps she was always meant to be a stepping stone. What matters is that within weeks, Elizabeth was moved into their household. She now lived beneath the same roof as the man who had proposed marriage to her, and with the woman she loved like a mother. Was that the plan from the beginning? The question hung over her like a fog she could not see through. Did he marry Catherine to get closer to her? Was the rejection not an end, but merely a detour? Elizabeth kept her doubts to herself. A girl in her position could not afford to speak them aloud. Instead, she watched. Thomas was more than a man with ambition. He was a man with a hunger for recognition. His brother, Edward Seymour, had just become Lord Protector, the most powerful man in the realm, after the boy king. Thomas, by comparison, was second, always second. And second sons are dangerous when they crave first place. So he did what clever men always do. He found a weakness and called it love. Elizabeth was the weakness. Young, unwed, royal, close enough to the crown to matter, far enough to be vulnerable. He smiled at her often, complimented her more. His eyes lingered too long when they passed. Catherine noticed. Perhaps she told herself it was her imagination. Elizabeth said nothing. She watched. She woke earlier each morning, dressed faster, studied longer. The letters stopped, but the presence remained, and when Thomas entered her room in the early hours, she did not scream. She did not run. She simply froze, breathed as shallowly as possible, and waited for the door to close behind him. Because this was not a man who could be confronted. This was a man who laughed when Cat Ashley told him to go away. A man who called his actions harmless. A man who thought power made him untouchable. And so she held her silence, not because she did not know what was wrong, but because she understood that speaking it aloud might ruin her. In the Tudor court, women who spoke of harm were called temptresses, liars, hysterics. Elizabeth had seen what happened to women who challenged the desires of men. Their names were scratched out of history. Their heads were removed. She would not be erased. So she learned to write. She learned to build her refusals out of grace. She learned to say no in 100 elegant ways. The ink became her sword. Her mind became her shield. And in the darkest corner of her chamber, where no one could see, she folded the letter from Thomas Seymour and placed it in the fire. She watched the wax curl, the words vanish, the ash settle. She remembered them anyway. Later, when history tried to romanticize that letter, to paint her as the blushing girl, the willing bride, she did not protest. She let them speak, because it did not matter what they believed. What mattered was that she had said no, and lived. It would not be the last time she said no. It would be the beginning. There is a particular kind of silence that only lives in a girl's bedroom before dawn, the moment when shadows are thickest. When the world has not quite decided if it will let her live another day the same, or let the walls shift again. Closer and darker. At Chelsea Manor, in the year 1547. That silence began to feel like a warning. Elizabeth Tudor had learned to sleep with her body still, but her ears awake. She could hear the difference between servant steps and those that moved barefoot, slow, with purpose, and when she heard that sound, her blood would begin to hum with fear. Thomas Seymour did not knock. He did not announce himself. He came into her chamber with the unearned ease of a man who believed access was his birthright. His legs were bare, his nightgown short, his grin always fixed and effortless. He made jokes about propriety while violating it. He smiled like a teacher, like a brother, like a man who thought every girl should feel flattered to be noticed. But he wasn't interested in Elizabeth's books, or her fluency in 6 languages, or her quiet brilliance. He was interested in her fear, in the way she froze when he reached for her shoulder, in the way her breath stilled when he sat at the edge of her bed. He touched her in ways that did not leave bruises, a slap on the back, a hand lingering too low on the waist, fingers that brushed the edge of a blanket, pulling just enough to unravel comfort. And every time he laughed afterward, it was to signal that nothing had happened, that she was imagining it, that the rules didn't apply because he meant no harm. It was all a game, he said. And she was too clever to misunderstand. Cat Ashley began to rise earlier, placing herself like a silent sentinel in the corner of Elizabeth's chamber, pretending to sew, pretending to sleep in a chair. But Thomas did not care. He greeted Cat with that same grin, called her Good Kate, and mocked her concern. "I meant no evil," he said, when she finally told him to leave for shame. But his eyes never left the bed. Elizabeth stopped dressing in mourning before dawn because of tradition. She did it because clothes were armor. If she was already standing, already composed, he might pass her by. If she was reading, the illusion of adulthood might protect her. But she was still only 14. And armor is thin when no one else believes you need it. Then came the mornings when Catherine Parr walked in beside him. No historian can tell us exactly why. Was it an attempt at control to monitor what she feared but could not confront? Was it denial? shaped as participation, or something darker. Jealousy, masquerading as maternal play. No one knows. What we do know is this. The Queen Dowager entered Elizabeth's room with her husband, and did not stop him. Worse, she joined him. There was laughter. There was tickling. There was the sense that this was all innocent, and if Elizabeth flinched, she was being too serious. Too sensitive. Too much. They say Catherine even helped hold her once, while Thomas pulled out a pair of scissors and cut her morning gown to ribbons, 100 strips of black silk. Torn, while the girl stood silent, shaking, not knowing whether to scream or smile or disappear. The Queen, who had once been her safe place, had become complicit. And there are no words for that kind of betrayal. Not in Latin. Not in French. Not even in the private diary she never dared write. Something changed after that. Catherine's warmth cooled into something suspicious. She accused Elizabeth of embracing men in gardens, of being too familiar with her servants. Cat Ashley saw it for what it was: projection. Perhaps a desperate attempt to shift the blame from husband to girl. When Catherine ordered Cat to watch Elizabeth more closely, to report every gesture, every look, the message was clear: you are the danger now. The victim had become the threat. And still, Elizabeth said nothing, not because she did not feel rage, not because she didn't ache to be held by someone who would not hurt her, but because she had already learned the rules of this world, the rules that said men could grin their way into your room, and women would turn their faces and call it discipline. To speak out was to fall. To accuse was to vanish. So she trained her voice to sound measured. She trained her body to obey. She became, with quiet agony, the perfect daughter of a broken crown. When Thomas was away, when the footsteps paused, she felt it like a reprieve. Her body loosened just enough to exhale. But it never lasted. And even when he left the room without touching her, the fear stayed behind like a perfume clinging to the sheets, soaked into the stone, lingering on her skin like shame. What does a child do with shame she cannot name? She writes. She writes in Latin. In the margins of letters, she crosses it out. She rewrites it. Let him not touch me. She folds the letter carefully, hands it to a servant, and watches it leave the room, unsure if anyone will understand, hoping Catherine will read the words and wake up, hoping someone will see past the politeness into the scream beneath. No one ever answered that plea. And so Elizabeth continued to wake before dawn. She continued to eat in silence beside the Queen and her husband. She practiced her curtsies. She kept her hands folded in her lap. The Tudor court would call her composed. In truth, she was surviving. One day, she would be called the Virgin Queen, the monarch who ruled without a man, the queen whose heart belonged to no one. But that title began here not as a symbol of pride, but as a consequence. She had not chosen chastity. It had been forced upon her by fear, and eventually, it became her power. But at 14, that power had not arrived yet. She was still a girl in a bed that no longer felt hers. A girl who had no language for what was happening to her. A girl who had to pretend the woman she loved most was not helping the man who came in barefoot and smiling every single morning. A girl who kept breathing, who kept learning, who held herself still when she wanted to run. And somewhere, deep inside, she made a vow, not with ceremony, not with fire, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has been violated and refuses to be violated again. This will not be the end of me. There are moments in history that leave no sound, only handwriting. Letters that survive centuries because a trembling hand pressed too hard into the parchment Letters that were not meant to save a kingdom, only to save a girl. It was in the spring of the year, 1548, and the house at Chelsea had gone quiet after too much laughter that wasn't real. Catherine Parr, now heavy with child, spent her afternoons resting by the window, her hands upon her stomach, her face pale from fatigue. Thomas Seymour drifted through the corridors like a restless ghost who did not know he was already dead. And Elizabeth, 15 now, kept to her chamber, reading Seneca, copying Latin phrases, pretending to study. The pretense was her shield. If she looked diligent, she was less visible. One evening, Catherine wrote a letter meant for her husband and asked Elizabeth to arrange a messenger. The parchment lay open on the table, the ink still drying, the seal still unpressed. Elizabeth picked it up. I looked at the words that were not hers, and suddenly felt the weight of all the words she had never been allowed to say. The candle beside her flickered, and she reached for her quill, almost without thinking. On the outside of the folded letter, where a servant's eyes would pass, and perhaps the Queen's as well, she wrote 3 words in Latin: Noli me tangere, thou touch me not. Her heart was pounding. She stared at the words. Rough. Too honest. Almost screaming. The air seemed to thicken around them. Fear crawled up her throat, because she knew that truth written plainly was dangerous. The truth could ruin her. The truth could be twisted into sin. She hesitated, dipped her keel again, and crossed the words out. Beneath them she wrote another line, softer but still pleading. Let him not touch me. It was not a command. It was not even defiance. It was a prayer. She folded the letter carefully, pressed the wax, and sealed it with her trembling fingers. Whether Catherine ever saw it, no one knows. The letter was never found. Only the memory of it, told years later by Cat Ashley, who said Elizabeth's hand had shaken when she wrote those words. The testimony survived. The parchment did not. But those 3 words, faint as breath, would become prophecy. For in them lived everything she had learned, and everything she would become: a woman who would speak through riddles, who would hide her pain behind grace, who would master the art of writing one thing and meaning another. Let him not touch me was the beginning of a language she would spend her life perfecting: diplomacy as armor, silence as resistance. Outside, the gardens bloomed, unaware of the storm inside the house. The Thames carried the scent of spring and rotting leaves. Servants moved through the halls, whispering about the Queen's coming child, about how Thomas Seymour spent too much money, too much time away, too much charm on the wrong people. Elizabeth heard everything, said nothing. She wrote instead. She copied verses about virtue and restraint. She translated Petrarch's laments about lost innocence. Her notebooks filled with voices that understood what she could not say aloud. There were mornings when she thought of running. There were nights when she prayed to the ghost of her mother, Anne Boleyn, the woman who had once stood tall and defiant before the axe. Elizabeth did not ask for justice. She asked for endurance. She understood by now that women in her family were not allowed the luxury of revenge, only survival. And survival required silence, calculation, timing. When Thomas came again, she bowed her head and stepped aside. He smiled, thinking he had won. He never saw that she was already learning him, memorizing his vanity, his greed, his blindness. She was learning that men who believe themselves untouchable eventually walk into their own ruin. Every cruel joke, every predatory glance, every morning visit, she stored them like kindling. And one day they would burn him. Cat Ashley tried once more to intervene. She told Catherine of the visits, of the mornings, of the laughter that was not laughter. Catherine dismissed her with a weary wave of the hand. "He means no harm," she said. And in that sentence, Elizabeth heard the death of protection. The Queen had chosen peace over truth, love over justice. And Elizabeth understood then that no woman, no mother, would ever stand between her and danger again. She would have to build that wall herself. When summer came, the air inside the manor grew heavy and restless. Catherine's health declined as her belly swelled. Thomas spent more time outside, riding, scheming, pretending at power. The servants avoided Elizabeth's eyes, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear that they might see too much of their own cowardice reflected back. And Elizabeth, though still a child, carried herself like a ghost who had seen the map of her own fate. She began to smile again, but it was the kind of smile that frightened people calm, distant, a little too knowing. She was learning how to wear composure as a mask. She was learning to become unreadable. History would later call this control. They would call it majesty. But it began here, in a terrified girl's ability to make her face still when everything inside was trembling. Catherine never answered the plea written on that letter. Perhaps she never saw it. Perhaps she did, and chose silence, ashamed of what she had allowed. Weeks later, she would give birth and die within days. Her body unable to recover from the strain. Thomas would be free again, prowling the edges of Elizabeth's life like a storm she could not yet outrun. But for a brief moment in those hours between the ink drying and the messenger's horse departing, Elizabeth had done something extraordinary. She had named what was happening to her. She had written the truth. Centurilateur. That truth still echoes, fragile but unbroken. Let him not touch me. It was not only a cry from a frightened child. It was a vow whispered into history that no man would ever touch her, claim her, or command her again. The candle beside her went out that night, and she did not light it again. The air smelled of wax and ink and something faintly metallic, like blood. She sat in the darkness, feeling the chill creep through her fingers, thinking of all the women before her who had begged for mercy in softer tones, and realizing that mercy was never given, only taken by those who dared to survive long enough to demand it. And so she decided, quietly, without witnesses, that she would survive, not as the girl in the bed, not as the victim, not even as the daughter of Anne Boleyn. She would become something the world could not easily harm: a myth, a symbol, a queen whose name would outlive every man who ever thought he owned her. But before that could happen, she would have to live through one last betrayal, one last humiliation, one last loss. The summer of 1548 was coming, and with it, the end of Catherine Parr, the death of protection, and the beginning of Elizabeth's exile. And though she did not yet know it, in the ink on that letter, those 3 words scratched out and rewritten would become the line she built her life upon. The air that summer was heavy and wet, the kind that clung to your skin even in the shade, and made everything smell like wilted roses and old stone. The house at Chelsea stood still, its windows shut against the buzzing of flies and the sound of servants moving more slowly than usual. Inside, Catherine Parr lay in confinement, swollen with child and softer now, quieter, as though the weight she carried had silenced something sharp in her. Her once commanding voice turned gentle, and her laughter, the same laughter that had once tickled a girl in bed beside a man who wasn't laughing, had faded to breathless murmurs. Elizabeth sat in the corners of rooms now. She watched everyone and trusted no one. Her pen scratched paper quietly, and when no one was looking, she would place a hand over her chest, just to feel her own heart still beating. She had not yet been sent away, but she knew it was coming. Everything in the house pointed toward a breaking. Thomas Seymour no longer hid his glances. He walked slower past her, spoke her name too often, left doors open that should have been closed. He smiled, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Catherine was no longer a wall between them. She was fading. And Elizabeth, once just a pawn in Seymour's game, was now a piece he was preparing to move. She felt it in the way he asked about her books, her music, her morning routines, as if he were cataloging her, as if the absence of Catherine would make Elizabeth his. And then Catherine gave birth. It was late August in the year 1548 when the child came, a daughter, born healthy and small, crying into a house where too many other voices had gone quiet. For 3 days Catherine lived, pale and trembling, her hands too weak to hold the infant. And then on the 4th morning, she was gone. Her body could not recover. Her blood would not stop flowing. Her breath slipped away as Thomas held her hand and called for help that came too late. The Queen Dowager died at 36. And the moment she was gone, the house changed. The servants began to whisper. Elizabeth did not cry. She stood at the window, in the same black gown Thomas had once cut to ribbons, and watched the sky darken. Though the hour was early, no one came to comfort her. Cat Ashley was miles away. No one fetched her books. No one asked how she felt. She was 15, and no longer anyone's daughter. No longer protected by a queen's affection. The man who had entered her room barefoot now walked freely through corridors with nothing to stop him. And she was no longer sure she had the strength to keep avoiding him. But fate, it seems, intervenes when shame will not. It happened 2 weeks later. In the middle of the day, when Catherine had only just been buried, and the nursery still smelled faintly of milk, Elizabeth was found in a room with Thomas, not alone. Not in scandal, but close enough to raise alarm. A servant opened the door and saw him holding her. Not just a hand on her shoulder. Not the passing brush of a cloak. He was embracing her, holding her in a way no man should hold a 15-year-old girl who was not his blood and not his wife. And this time, someone saw. Catherine's old lady-in-waiting ran to tell the others. The household buzzed with fear. The next morning, Elizabeth was gone. Whether she left or was sent, no one can say with certainty. Some claim she chose to go, that her dignity could no longer survive in the same rooms as Thomas. Others said Thomas himself insisted she leave, afraid now that eyes were watching. But the truth lived somewhere between. She departed quietly, without fanfare, without escort, and traveled to Cheshunt, to stay with Cat Ashley's sister, where the air was cleaner and the stairs less sharp. But the damage had already been done. Almost as soon as she arrived, Elizabeth fell ill. It began as headaches, searing, blinding, the kind that made her cover her eyes even in candlelight. Then came the nausea, the jaundice, the irregular bleeding, the days when she could not rise from bed, the nights when her sheets were soaked with sweat, her skin lost its color, her appetite vanished. The doctors called it a fever of the blood, a disease of the humors. But Cat Ashley, who had seen her through every stage of girlhood, knew better. This was not a sickness of the body. It was the kind of illness that burrowed into the spirit, born from months of fear, of confusion, of having no place to run. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. That summer, Elizabeth's body betrayed her. Every tremble, every skipped breath, every time her fingers trembled over her spoon, it was memory becoming symptom. Her period disappeared. then returned with violence, then vanished again. The court began to whisper. She was pale and thin, and Thomas Seymour was widowed. The two facts became gossip, and soon, the gossip became a rumor. They said she was pregnant. 60 years later, the rumor would be repeated in books, passed down as the secret history of the Virgin Queen, that she had carried Thomas Seymour's child and lost it in hiding. But the truth is simpler and sadder. There was no child. There was only trauma. There was only a girl, exhausted, terrified, and alone, who had been watched, touched, humiliated, and blamed, and whose body simply could not keep pretending that everything was fine. And yet, Elizabeth survived. She did not write to Thomas. She did not answer his messages. He sent his nephew to visit her at Hatfield later, that autumn. After she had recovered enough to sit up, the boy brought no flowers, no apologies. Only a crude question whether her great buttocks had grown any less. The question was designed to reduce her, to strip her of the intellect that had always protected her. It was not about desire. It was about dominance. A reminder that even now, miles away, he still believed she was his, to comment on. She did not reply. She simply turned her face toward the window and let the silence fall between them like stone. The summer ended, but its shadow remained. She had not chosen exile. It had been forced upon her, and yet it was there, in the quiet halls of Cheshunt, that she began to become something new, not just a survivor, but a strategist. She read again, wrote letters with more precision, practiced her languages until they flowed like blood in her mouth. She had been broken, but not destroyed. The court would soon come calling again. Her name would be dragged into scandal. She would be interrogated by the Privy Council. Her servants would be arrested. She would be asked again and again, did you love him? Did you agree? Were you complicit? And every time, she would answer with the same face she wore during that long, sick summer, calm, unbroken, unreadable, because the truth was no longer just pain. It was her armor, and the vow she had written, let him not touch me, had become something more. A boundary, a prophecy, a sentence she would live by until the day she died. Autumn slipped into England like a shadow through the trees. The air crisp and sour with the scent of dying leaves and wet stone. At Hatfield House, the fires were kept burning long into the mornings. But Elizabeth still woke cold. She was recovering now. At least that was the word used by the women who brought her broth and warm cloths, who spoke softly and did not ask questions. Her strength had returned slowly, not in leaps, but in the way an ember stubbornly refuses to die. Her color came back first, then her appetite, but her voice remained quiet, deliberate, measuring every word before releasing it. Elizabeth had learned the price of speaking too soon. She had learned the weight of being overheard. The rumors had not stopped, though she was miles from court. The noise had followed her like smoke. They whispered that she had been pregnant, that she had been seduced, that she had been sent away not for rest, but for shame. None of them knew. They didn't know the way she had lain in bed through that thick of land. Unbearable summer, to her skin on fire, her thoughts unraveling. They didn't know what it meant to tremble every time a door creaked. They didn't know what it cost her to be touched even gently, even in kindness. What they knew were stories. What she carried were scars. And then the message came. He had not forgotten her. That was the first thing she realized when she heard his name. Thomas Seymour. Now a widower. Now unguarded by Catherine's presence. had sent someone to her. Not a letter this time. Not a question wrapped in silk and courtesy. He sent his nephew. John Seymour was young, handsome, and easily forgettable, a courier with noble blood and a foolish tongue. Elizabeth was in the garden when he arrived. The sky was gray. The trees had begun to crack their golden shells, and the earth was soft beneath her shoes. She had been walking in silence, collecting her thoughts like fallen leaves. John bowed, gave her a stiff smile, and delivered the question he had been sent to carry. It was simple, short, cruel. Has her Grace's great buttocks grown any less or no? The words landed like a slap across the face of memory. Elizabeth did not flinch. Her eyes held steady. She turned away from him, not with fury, but with something colder, dismissal. The kind of silence that freezes even laughter, the kind of silence that makes cruelty shrink in its own echo. He did not understand what he had done. That was always the danger. Men like Thomas believed they could humiliate you even from a distance, that their language could crawl beneath your skin long after their hands had been forced away. But Elizabeth knew better now. She knew that the only power left to Seymour was the memory of what he had once tried to be, and the hope that his words could still own a piece of her. They didn't. She walked away, and the boy stood blinking in the garden, holding a question that had already wilted. Later that day, she sat with her books again, Latin on one page, Greek on the next. She translated the works of Stoics and saints, wrote her own annotations. She was no longer reading to survive. She was reading to prepare. Something was coming. She could feel it. Her illness had passed. But the court had not forgotten her, and neither had he. In London, Thomas Seymour was growing reckless. The death of his wife had not broken him, it had freed him. With Catherine gone, he believed himself one step closer to power. He was the uncle of the boy king, the brother of the Lord Protector. He was charming, well-dressed, and dangerous in the way that only a man who believes he cannot fall ever becomes. He still wanted Elizabeth. Maybe for her crown, maybe for her silence, maybe because she had refused him, and he had never known what to do with women who said no. So he plotted. He whispered in the wrong ears. He made plans that danced too close to treason. And all the while, Elizabeth said nothing. She read. She waited. She listened. Thomas Seymour believed silence was submission. What he did not know was that her silence was a fortress. Inside it, she was sharpening herself. When Cat Ashley returned to her side, bringing news from court of rumors, of arrests, of watchful eyes, Elizabeth listened without fear. She asked for ink. She drafted letters with the poise of a woman twice her age. She refused to panic. She refused to flee. Because Elizabeth had learned something that Thomas Seymour never would, that power did not come from possession. It came from restraint, from surviving. And when they came for her, when the interrogators arrived with their questions and their suspicion, she would be ready. But in this moment, as the sun faded behind Hatfield, and the wind pulled loose the last of summer's leaves, she sat still. The memory of his final insult folded into the quiet of the evening. Words, she thought, could be sharper than blades, but they could also be dulled, forgotten, outlived. She would outlive them. She would outlive him, and everything he had ever tried to reduce her to, her body, her silence. Her shame would one day kneel before her crown. The winter of the year 1549 came not with frost, but with footsteps loud, deliberate, official. The gates of Hatfield opened before dawn, and the men who passed through them wore the weight of law like armor. They did not bring swords drawn, but they carried questions sharpened into weapons. Elizabeth Tudor was 15 years old when the Privy Council came for her. And though she had seen no battlefield, she knew the first rule of survival: never let them see you bleed. The world had changed again. In London, Thomas Seymour had finally overreached. The stories came in pieces, like shattered glass, too dangerous to gather with bare hands. He had tried to break into the king's chambers at Hampton Court, armed. In the middle of the night, he had tampered with the locks, frightened the guards, startled the dog, and the dog, not knowing the rules of nobility, had barked, lunged, and died for it. Thomas had killed it with his own sword. A boy king had been awoken by blood on the floor and the face of his uncle in the dark. That was the end. Seymour was arrested, dragged to the tower, where so many before him had stood, confident they would not fall, right until the axe made them liars. The charges were treasonous. He had sought to marry Elizabeth without the council's approval. He had planned to steal the young king. He had sought control of the crown by any means necessary: marriage, seduction, manipulation. The man who had once grinned barefoot in the chambers of a child was now pacing the cold stone of a prison cell, still smiling, still convinced that someone, anyone would save him. But no one did. At Hatfield, Elizabeth felt the wind shift. She had lived her life beneath storms, but this one carried her name. Because Seymour's crimes were not committed in silence, he had spoken to too many people, whispered in too many ears, sent too many letters, and now those whispers were coming for her. The council summoned not just the man, but everyone who had stood near him. Cat Ashley was taken first, questioned, detained, kept from Elizabeth without warning. Then Thomas Parry, Elizabeth's treasurer. Both had been there when the visits began, when the letters came, when the gown was cut. They had seen what others only suspected, and now, to save themselves, they told everything. The interrogators wanted to know, had Elizabeth consented? Had she encouraged it? Had she plotted to marry the man who touched her? The lines between victim and accomplice blurred in the eyes of those who saw power as something to be feared in the hands of a girl. The mere idea of a princess having secrets was enough to call her dangerous. And then, they came for her. She sat alone before men, old enough to be her father. And each question was a test not only of truth, but of poise. They asked if she had been promised marriage, if she had known of Seymour's intentions, if she had returned his affections. They waited for cracks in her voice, for trembling in her hands, for the foolish honesty of youth. But Elizabeth had learned from her enemies. She had studied silence. She had practiced the art of saying nothing with grace. She gave them words that slipped through fingers like water. Never lies. Never confessions. Only the kind of answers that left no doors open behind them. When they asked, "Would you have married him if he asked?" she looked them in the eye and replied, "When that comes to pass, I will do as God shall put into my mind." It was a sentence without commitment, and yet full of meaning. She had not said yes. She had not said no. She had simply remained sovereign over her own intentions, and that was more terrifying to them than any confession. Behind her, her governess and her treasurer trembled, offering the council a mosaic of mournings and touch and lowered gowns. But Elizabeth sat steady, her voice a thread of steel. She did not deny what they had seen, but she did not confirm the worst. She understood now that survival was not just about what you lived through, it was about what you refused to give away. In the tower, Thomas Seymour waited. He wrote letters, pleaded, laughed, perhaps even believed that Elizabeth would intervene. that she would speak his name in defense, that the girl he had once cornered in a garden might save him now. She did not. The council debated his fate for weeks. He had been reckless. Yes, but he had also been royal. And royalty died slowly in England. They searched for hesitation in her testimony. They found none. They looked for romantic desperation in her letters. There was only diplomacy. In the end, the weight of his ambition buried him. On the 20th day of March, in the year 1541, Thomas Seymour was led to the scaffold at Tower Hill. The crowd gathered beneath grey skies, their breath rising in clouds. He walked with the same posture he had worn in court, the same misplaced confidence that had once made even queens blush. He still believed. Some said that the king might pardon him at the last moment. But the blade did not hesitate. It fell once. It was enough. Back at Hatfield, when Elizabeth was told the news, she said only one sentence. This day died a man with much wit and very little judgment. No tears. No relief. No curse. Just a verdict. Clean. Final. Royal. She did not call him her stepfather. She did not offer prayers for his soul. She did not say his name. In that silence, she took back everything he had tried to own. And then she rose. She wrote to the council with calm courtesy. She asked for the return of Cat Ashley and Thomas Parry. She resumed her studies. She practiced her calligraphy. She answered no more questions. The girl who had once trembled in bed while a man smiled at her, fear was gone. What remained was someone else quieter and wiser, unbreakable. Not yet a queen, but already becoming sovereign. She was 25 when the crown touched her head. A golden band laid gently upon red hair that had once clung to a pillow soaked in tears. Hair once brushed by trembling hands before dawn to keep him from seeing her undone. It was the year 1558, and the people of England cheered, as if their voices could erase the years that had come before, as if glory could rise clean from pain. But Elizabeth Tudor knew better. She knew that no crown came without ghosts, and hers would never stop whispering. They called her Gloriana. They called her Good Queen Bess. They built portraits and pageants and poems that painted her as more than mortal, a goddess in pearls, an angel in velvet, a monarch untouched. But behind the veil of majesty lived a woman who had survived not just ambition and war, but hands that trespassed and words that wounded. She had survived a kind of violence that left no bruises on her skin, only cracks in her trust, only the memory of cold stone and a man's breath in the dark. They expected her to marry. Almost immediately, the ambassadors came from Spain, from France, from the Holy Roman Empire, dukes with gold rings, princes with perfect teeth, kings with family trees, too old to question. All of them brought flowers. All of them brought contracts. All of them wanted more than a wife. They wanted the crown, the throne, the heir, her body as a vessel, her voice as an ornament. She smiled at them all. She spoke their languages, praised their customs. Let her eyes linger where theirs hungered. She flirted with nations. She danced with kings in her letters. She promised nothing. And when the council leaned in, when even her closest men urged her to choose, she lifted her head and spoke with a calm they could not break. I am already bound unto a husband, the kingdom of England. They did not understand. How could they? They had not stood barefoot on cold stone, while a man grinned in the dark. They had not swallowed words like thorns, just to live another day. They had not written their first vow in Latin across the edge of a letter. Let him not touch me. They thought her celibacy was holy. They thought it was myth. They called her virgin, because the world did not have the courage to call her survivor. But Elizabeth knew. She knew what it meant to say no, and never stop saying it. She knew what it meant to love no one more than her own sovereignty. She knew what it meant to be kissed by ambition and recoil. She knew the kind of loneliness that came not from lack, but from wisdom. She ruled alone not because she was unloved, but because she had once been touched by a man who taught her that love without consent was just conquest in disguise. And so she made herself untouchable, not by hiding, but by becoming bigger than any man who had ever tried to own her. She held court with grace, with wit, with fire. She debated scholars. She navigated war. She tamed factions with a glance. She ruled for 45 years. She survived plots, papal threats, and rebellion. She outlived every man who once saw her as a pawn. She crushed the Spanish Armada. She grew old in power, not in shadow. And through it all, she never married, never bore a child, never knelt beside a husband's chair. Some say she regretted it in the end, that her bed grew cold, that the absence of an heir haunted her, that the Tudor line withered on her death. But what they miss is that she did not live to continue a name. She lived to reclaim her own, the name they once spat as bastard, the name that had survived a mother's execution, a father's indifference, a stepfather's cruelty, the name that once trembled beneath a blanket in the early hours of a silent house. That name became her country, and when she died, in the year 1603, with no child by her side, no husband's hand in hers, she died, not as a girl forgotten, but as the woman the world had no choice but to remember, because Elizabeth had taught them something none of her ancestors had, that you can rule with a heart unowned. That power need not pass through a man's hands, and that sometimes the fiercest love is the love a woman gives herself when the world gives her every reason not to. She was England's queen, but she was also the girl who once wrote 5 words that changed her life. She did not shout them. She whispered them. She wrote them. She lived them. Let him not touch me. And no man ever did again.